So last night I spoke on this Ime Udoka situation without having all the facts. And I think as a part of the media, often the media speaks to something, and when they're wrong, they won't come out and say it. And since I'm a part of the media now, and I try not to be like everyone else, I try to, report and talk with facts and honesty. And I clearly have to say last night, without knowing all the facts, I spoke on Ime Udoka's defense. And after finding out the facts after I spoke, I erased what I posted, because this situation in Boston is deep, it's messy, it's 100 times uglier than any of us thought. And that's why I erased what I said. Some things happened that I can't condone, I can't back, and it's not my place to tell you what happened. If it ends up coming out, it ends up coming out. But that was the reason why I erased in my post last night, because after I posted it, I got a call from someone who had all the details, and the shit is deep. So, man, praying for everybody involved. Hope everyone gets through this. And I saw a lot of blogs picked up what I said, even though it was only on my page for like 2 minutes. So hopefully they pick this up too, for me being wrong and jumping out there without the facts. So that's where I'm gonna leave it. God bless, and I hope everyone has a good weekend.
You can see we have a panel here to cover every angle of this story and the press conference. I'm joined by senior NBA insider Adrian Wojnarowski, senior writer Zach Lowe, and our analyst Chiney Agumake. Thank you all for being here. Woj, I wanted to start with you here. What stood out to you as we heard from the Celtics brass for the first time?
Well, listen, obviously the seriousness with which they took the violation that occurred in Boston, the fact that they were willing to suspend a coach with no certain return date, if ever, who got them within 2 games of an NBA championship in the middle of what they thought would be, and still hope can be, a championship window. And certainly I think you saw the gravity, I think Brad Stevens wore it, of the impact that this entire episode has had on that organization, specifically women in that organization, beyond just a particular woman who had a relationship with Ime Udoka. And so, listen, I think this has been jarring for the Celtics. It's certainly jarring for those involved. I think it has been jarring for people all around the NBA.
Zach?
It's been shocking. It's in a lot of ways was more shocking than the Robert Sarver story that shocked all of us for a year. What struck me the most was I've never seen Brad Stevens look like that before. Brad Stevens is distraught. He's shaken up. And it evinced to me, this was his hire. This was the guy he tabbed to coach the team. And it looked almost like he felt a sense of betrayal. And look, this whole story has been incredibly uncomfortable, because at its base, it is a human story with families that are going to be wrecked. There has been a rush just across the board, a rush to identify the woman, which was frankly disgusting, a rush to evaluate the severity or lack of severity or whatever you feel about the suspension, a rush in some corners to defend Ime Udoka without really knowing all of the facts, all of the workplace dynamics, all of the power dynamics, and all of the implications of those power dynamics. Does someone have to get reassigned, moved around, demoted? What are the potential implications of that for the Celtics organization legally? These are enormously complicated issues. But my broader takeaway was Brad Stevens looks distraught, and the longer this goes, the harder it is to imagine Ime Udoka walking back in and coaching the team. It's still possible. They made it clear it's still possible. It just seems far-fetched to me.
Yeah, and, watching the press conference, I actually took notes. And there were 2 things that I'd like to reiterate that we all heard. One, that the Celtics brought in an independent law firm to conduct the investigation. And I know that there's a lot of chatter online about, oh, this was a consensual relationship between 2, adults, whatever the case is, because the internet and social media takes a life of its own. But when the workplace is involved with relationships, there's protocols, there's rules, there's standards that elevated this beyond HR to having an independent external law firm come in and make these determinations. And this also shows that, this was based on facts and findings that we may not be privy to or should have to be privy to. And that's the first thing that stood out. The second thing is that no one else is facing penalty other than Ime Udoka. And I feel like this is important because people keep saying we need to hear the woman's perspective, we need to find out who this person is, and hear that side as well if we're hearing Ime's side. At the end of the day, the investigation heard all perspectives necessary to come to this determination, and no one besides Udoka received a penalty. And to me, that speaks volumes.
And I think it speaks to a different time in professional sports where, I know people might say there have been these situations in the past, they didn't come to light. I think, and Wick Grossbeck said it, the Celtics are a corporation and a business, and that perhaps 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 7 years ago, however, it might have been treated differently by an organization because a successful head coach, no one's irreplaceable, but certainly they, as a basketball coach, Ime Udoka, as a leader, they believed, and for good reason, that they had an individual that would be for a very long time leading this organization. An organization maybe in the past would have found a way for this to have not escalated to an internal, bringing a law firm to do an investigation, and then to mete out this kind of punishment. And so I think that's what's different about this, and it speaks to it is the year 2022.
Correct.
Not only that, but you said escalated. And I think it's important to note, we don't know how or when and why it escalated. And that there's a gap of information, both of time and information missing there, that I think would reveal a lot about this story. We just don't know what sort of triggered this from going something that was going on to something that was now being investigated. That is a very important puzzle piece of what happened here.
And listen, we talk about Ime Udoka's future in Boston, and it is very uncertain. And there was no sense today that it is going to just be, and I've not gotten any sense, and I don't think Ime Udoka's gotten any sense, that this is going to be, that there's an easy pathway.
Yeah.
They didn't lay out criteria today of what it would take for him to come back. I do not think the final chapter has necessarily been written on his coaching career, and certainly other teams, other organizations are going to need to and want to find out exactly what happened. Different organizations are going to have different thresholds. Some might consider, some might not at all consider Ime Udoka. I think there's plenty who will, but they're going to have to know what happened there. But as I think both Shanae and Zach said, it may be difficult for him to walk back in the door and lead and be the leader of that organization.
Well, one thing, Zach, that you touched on was just this gross focus on identifying unnecessarily women's names that may or may not be involved. And I think it is it isn't too harsh to say that that was a failure by many people, including folks within our own industry. And Brad Stevens actually addressed that today. I want everyone to take a listen.
We have a lot of talented women in our organization, and I thought yesterday was really hard on them, and I think that nobody can control Twitter speculation and rampant, but I do think that we as an organization have a responsibility to make sure we're there to support them now, because a lot of people were dragged unfairly into that.
I want to bring in our NBA analyst Kendrick Perkins into this conversation because, Perk, you played for the Celtics organization. What were your thoughts on this message here?
Well, one, to me, I didn't like Brad's comments on this, and let me explain why. Not the fact that he was taking up and protecting the women in the organization, but he said about the speculations and the Twitter BS and things to that nature, and how unfair it was to the women in the organization that is not involved with this particular situation. And I get that, right? But why is it speculations? It's speculations because of the reports that were put out by the actual Boston Celtics. So they didn't do a great job from the jump of actually protecting the women in their organization, because knowing that they were going to sit up here and give out this information and go out here and suspend Ime Udoka and talk about just give a little details, it's going to have people speculating. And in my eyes, I feel like the Boston Celtics dropped the ball not only in protecting their entire franchise, but in protecting the women as well, and also the players. Think about this for a second. It's no way in hell that everyone in this organization didn't know about this situation over the last however many months, probably the last year, right? Everybody knew about it. So now you're bringing players involved. Nobody's even talking about how the players are going to be affected. Nobody's going to be talking about how maybe the players are going to get called into office and have to deal with a situation or talk about a situation when they really shouldn't have to be doing that anyway, because everybody knew about it. So my thing was this: before this came out publicly, before they decided to make a decision, they should have made sure that they crossed their T's and dotted their I's before they put this information out. And I get it. Now we're to this point, and now he had to go on here and he had to say this and he had to say that to protect those innocent women. But at the end of the day, man, it just ain't right how they went about it.
And Perk, I have to agree with you to some degree, because a lot of times the Celtics, what they got right was probably the process, bringing someone in externally and handling an investigation. But the proliferation of the information is what dragged the women through the mud. And to me, as a woman who works in the sports industry, and you know a lot of these colleagues, it just is unfair what they've had to deal with. And even though the intentions were right, the way that the messaging went out and how it was handled, that's another way that you have to look in the mirror as an organization and say, when we're in times like this, and I think everyone around the NBA is looking, when we're in times like this, unfortunately, you know, God forbid, but if there's a situation, we have to make sure everyone's protected as we're releasing this information. And I think to Zach's point, I know you said you didn't agree, Perk, about, you know, Brad Stevens and his comments. I think what you saw there was the president of basketball operations feeling, you know, disheartened based on the experiences he's had, because he's now no longer in that head coach role where you handle the X's and O's. Instead, he's probably the one that's the face to face and having plethora of conversations with these women, seeing them being distraught or even just having to manage that. I think that's what you're seeing more so from Brad Stevens, not necessarily saying that, you know, everything that they handled was perfect.
Right, and listen, I agree to that aspect, but here's the thing too. The word accountability, okay? Accountability doesn't just go to Ime Udoka, okay? Accountability goes to the other people that played a part in that as well. Let me tell you another thing I didn't like about my good friend Wick Grossbeck and Brad Stevens in this press conference when they asked, is anybody else going to be punished? And they said no. And my whole thing is this, right? These are some of the facts that have been out. These are some facts that I know that, you know, this relationship, one of these relationships that was had with Ime Udoka and one of these women, it was consensual, meaning that this woman actually played a part in it too. So my thing is, yes, Ime Udoka was wrong. We get that. His punishment, he deserved that, and whatever else follows, I hate it for him, but he put himself in this position. But why are the other people getting left off the hook?
Well,
that's the problem that I have right now. Everybody got to be held accountable.
I think that we need to circle back to what Shanae said, is that there was an investigation that was conducted by an independent law firm here, and I think that transparency is what will rule the day here. And so without having all of the information, it is unfair and irresponsible of us to go and to speculate on that, because what we have to...
Well, I'm not speculating. Sure. I have the information. I'm not speculating.
But what we have to go with here is the fact that an independent law firm came in, did this investigation, and the facts that they were presented, they came to the conclusion that Ime Udoka violated a policy that warranted a 1-year suspension. And I share your frustration with the lack of transparency, while understanding that there is some things that they need to, from a legal perspective, keep private. But knowing all of that, understanding all of that, we have to come to the conclusion that whatever rule, the conduct that was broken on one side, it is not the same on the other side. I thank you for your perspective. We will revisit this story later in our show. We also have a little bit of basketball to get to, so still to come on NBA Today. Hear what Steve Kerr had to say about Steph Curry and Is Giannis the best player in the league? Plus, of Boston, as Adrian Wojnarowski reported, center Robert Williams will be out 8 to 12 weeks after undergoing successful surgery on his left knee. That timeline has Williams back at the earliest around the end of November, but the latest would be Christmas. And so, coming off a finals loss, it's been a tough offseason for the Celtics. They started it with lead assistant coach Will Hardy going to the Jazz. Boston made some big offseason moves. They acquired Malcolm Brogdon from the Pacers, but then Danilo Gallinari tore his ACL. We got this news from Woj a couple of weeks ago, and the surgery now completed. The Celtics have announced that Robert Williams is going to be out 8 to 12 weeks, and Ime Udoka has been suspended for the season. So up until this week, the Celtics, they were widely considered, when you looked at the Vegas lines even, the winners of the offseason and the favorites heading into the year. But there is so much that is going on in Boston right now. So, Zach, I'm going to start with you here. When you look at what is going to happen with the Celtics on the court this year, how do you assess that?
So the Celtics season turned last year when they implemented a new defensive scheme that was centered around Robert Williams. The two most important ingredients in that scheme were Ime Udoka, who with his coaches came up with it, and Robert Williams, who they put off the ball and said, you're going to guard the worst offensive player on the other team, regardless of position, and block the heck out of everybody at the rim. And they took off like a rocket ship. Both those ingredients are gone. One for the whole season, one for 30-plus games. You mentioned Gallinari. You didn't mention Jaylen Brown kind of recovering from being mentioned in Kevin Durant trade talks. It's just so much instability. It's hard enough to win a title, which is the goal, when everything's great and everyone's healthy. It's really hard when you got to come together and shut out all this noise and deal with these kind of injuries.
Well, I think that, I'm a glass half full girl, okay?
We all know you're a glass half full girl.
I'm a glass half full girl.
If there's the slightest bit of sunshine, Chiney is going to, and
I'm going to find it. Okay, so I'm going to start with the good, right? The good is that this is a team that was 2 wins away from, an NBA championship. So they have the blueprint. They have the roadmap to figure out, we know what it feels like. We know what a final series feels like. We know exactly what that defense was like. We know who we need to have off ball. We know who we need to have on ball. They have that feel, and for hoopers, that's very important because you feel like once you know that, you can build off of that. And so they're going to probably feel like we can go out there and compete. But at the end of the day, having a young coach, the youngest in the NBA, right, Malika, 34 years old, that's stepping in, that has 3 years as an assistant coach on staff with the Celtics, it's all about adjustments when it comes to the biggest moments of the year, when it comes to the playoffs. And so that experience of trying to navigate what we knew last year that worked, but also what is your style and how that can work for us now, that's going to be really difficult. So I'm not completely down because these players are mature enough, and every year we've seen individually with their game. Talented, yeah. Every year individually with their game, they make leaps and bounds. It's just, strategically in those difficult moments, 1 possession, 2 possession games, how do we defend this? How do we score on that? That's sort of where you need that coach to elevate you, and we'll see what Coach Joe has.
Kendrick?
You know what? I feel pretty confident in the Celtics, even though they've been through a lot and they dealing with this situation. And here's why. When you're dealing with this type of situation, I feel like this could bring the team even closer, okay? And I feel like when you look at Brad Stevens and he said this was the best guy for the job and it wasn't even close, that means that goes to show me that he actually have a relationship and he has the respect in that locker room. And when you have guys like Al Horford, a guy like Al Horford in there that could actually be an extension of the coach on and off the floor, then all of a sudden you could have that togetherness. All of a sudden, we watched the Celtics last year. We watched them struggle tremendously the first half of the season to the point where I thought it was time to break the Jays up, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum.
We remember.
All of a sudden, they gathered it.
We remember.
Yeah, it's cool. I know we keep receipts. It's all good. Listen, but it came down to the point they were about 3 games below 500, and then they went on one of the best regular season runs towards the end of the season in NBA history. So this team thrive off of adversity. They're going to miss Robert Williams, but they have enough to get it done. Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are going to take the necessary steps for their leadership, and they'll be okay. I think they'll be fine.
And Perk, I know that was reverse psychology. Like, let me say break up the Jays so that they come together and band against me, and then we start winning. I mean, just a little bit.
No, that's really how I felt.
I feel you. I think, especially to Zach's point, you're going to miss that anchor in Robert Williams, but at the same time, when did the Celtics turn things around? Around Christmas Day? That's when you can potentially get him back, and they turned into the #1 defense for the rest of the season. So as much as it looks bad not having him, I do think there is a little bit where, it would help. You're right, Malik. I see her on the side, like saying, you need him from the jump. This is true. But having him at all next season, you have enough talented players to stay afloat in the East.
Yeah, well, particularly, I have faith in what Malcolm Brogdon. I know it's completely different when we're talking about big men here, but I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch for the Celtics on the court this season.